This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, I thought today we could do something a little bit different than usual. See, one of the first videos I ever made on my channel was a guided tour of the Lusitania, showing you some of the interesting aspects of the design on the drawing of the ship that I just recently completed. Well, today, I thought we could do the same thing for the Titanic, because I don't think I've done another one for like over a year. Got my Titanic drawing loaded up here, and I'm gonna put myself on the green screen now. There you go, that was easy. Now I've got the drawing up, I guess it makes sense to start from the front and work our way back. I'm going to zoom right in and look at the bow section. And there's a couple of interesting things going on here. Start with the ship's nameplate. It's a nice little place to start. You can see that it's picked out in a golden yellow color, and these are actually engraved, these letters, into the side of the ship. Not in any particular typeface or font. A very thin lettering that White Star used on basically all of its ships. It's probably closest to Franklin Gothic demi-condensed light. That's what I used here. Fairly close. The outside of the lettering, the edges, was actually engraved into the hull plating, not the whole thing. So they were just kind of doing the outline and then coloring in. And conspiracy theorists would have you believe that the letters were actually bolted onto the side of the ship. And it's just not true. And actually on the wreck of the Titanic, you can see the outline of some of the letters still engraved on the Titanic's nameplate. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see a couple of portholes either side of the nameplate. These aren't actually portholes. They're a type of fairlead, which is a hole that can have like ropes and mooring lines pass through while the ship's tying up. In fact, directly in line with the nameplate, there's actually a bit of a secret hidden machinery room that was placed here. There's a ton of machinery in here that powers the winches and things up on the forecastle deck here that was used for like pulling in the anchor cable, pulling in and hauling in mooring lines when the ship had cast off. So they'd cast off those big heavy mooring ropes and then pull them back on board the ship. Sitting up here directly on top of the forecastle deck or forecastle deck is the ship's anchor crane. So this was a big triangular looking thing that was very, very simple in its function. It was not powered, so the crane itself had no electric engine or anything. It just sat on a shaft that ran straight down into that handling deck I was just telling you about. And the triangular part could swivel around and pick up the Titanic's central anchor. So you can see there's one anchor directly below the anchor crane. There's another anchor just forward of that here sitting on the deck. This was a redundancy anchor. It was a spare. I think Board of Trade requirements at the time suggested that all ships needed to carry at least 3 main anchors on the bow of the ship. So Titanic's biggest anchor was the one that sat here. And given that this was probably more of a redundancy, like a backup, I don't think they put too much thought into how it was going to be deployed. So for these purposes, an anchor crane was fine. It just kind of sat there. I don't think Titanic's central anchor was ever used. I think it may have been Britannic's central anchor that may have been used once to keep her in place during a storm in the Mediterranean, but Titanic's I don't think was ever deployed. Moving along the forecastle deck, you see that there is a bell sitting down here at the base of the mast. So this is an interesting thing because all 3 Olympic-class sister ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, had their own bell placed down here, and they're all different in their arrangement. So Titanic's faced aft of the mast, it sat at the back of the mast. Olympic sat forward of the mast, and Britannic sat jutting out on the starboard or right-hand side of the mast. So that's an interesting little way of picking the sisters apart. It was a small bell. This was used to ring up confirmation of orders or if a task had been done to the bridge. And in fact, the bridge itself had their own smaller bell up here, right in the center line. And this could have been used to ring in watches or to also ring confirmation back down. And that confirmation had been received that the task had been completed. We're talking tasks like pulling in the anchors, the mooring ropes, that kind of thing. Anything involving that heavy duty machinery up on the forecastle deck. And also, this is another kind of redundancy. This bell could be used in fog if the ship's whistles or steam lines weren't working, for example, to ring out. And the sound would carry across the water. So although it's obviously not as powerful as the ship's main horns, a bell can be quite effective still. Of course, if you scroll up and look about halfway up the mast, you'll find the crow's nest, and this had the biggest of the ship's bells, and this is the one that they rang when they saw that there was an iceberg ahead. Of course, there was also a telephone. Believe it or not, there were also little pedestal telephones that could be installed and removed as required down here on the forecastle deck so that you could have direct conversation with the bridge. And in fact, there were other telephones aft on the Titanic's docking bridge. We'll get there in a minute. Here in the well deck, you can see that there are actually these big panels. These could actually be removed. So these were like a kind of gate. They sat flush with the Titanic's hull. And if you needed to bring things on like barrels instead of necessarily getting the crane out over the side and pulling them in, you could probably just like put them on a gangway and roll them up onto the Titanic's well deck. So it was probably used a little more while Titanic was being built. You can actually see the gangways sometimes aren't installed, but there were 2 on either side of the well deck, forward and aft at the aft well deck. Now look, just before we go on with this video, I wanted to tell you a quick story about when I was a struggling artist just starting out in 2018. See, back then I knew I enjoyed drawing ships, but I didn't know what to do about it, so I set about starting up a new business, then called Liner Designs, and built my website using Squarespace. And this is completely true. I'm really happy to do an advert for them because I've been using Squarespace now for about 5 years. There were 3 things that really worked for me. There was the easy blog creating function, so I could write articles about ships. This is one of my favorites, about my friend Ken Beard, who was a former P&O crewman. I like how graphic everything is. You can make beautiful photo slideshows and get really high quality images. They just look stunning. I also enjoy the advanced analytics. There's something really nice about seeing people access the site from all over the world. If you want to build your own website or blog like me, check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready for launch, go to squarespace.com/Oceanliner Designs to get 10% off your first website or domain purchase. Be sure to share the link to your new website in the comments to this video. We'll be sure to go and check it out. Now, one interesting thing about the funnels here, here's the number 1 funnel. You can see that there's pipes, both fore and aft here. So the one on the forward aspect and another set of pipes on the aft aspect, and they're kind of like a loop shape. So this is a really easy way of maintaining water pressure. You don't need pumps on a ship like this. You can create water pressure from gravity. So a lot of these funnel pipes could run up the funnel and back down, provide a constant source of water pressure. In fact, the pipes on the after aspect of the funnel here run directly down into a little tank. So that could have been like a freshwater tank. I forget exactly what it was used for. Now here, just after the funnel, we have like a really big looking extractor type vent. And this is a really interesting kind of vent because it services the ship's elevators, which are directly below. So these link directly into the Titanic's elevator housing for the forward machinery for the elevators there. Those elevators ran from A deck, I think, down to about E deck. On Britannic, this was raised upper deck, so the elevator would take you all the way up to the boat deck. But on Titanic, it only went from A deck down. So the machinery was housed on the boat deck. And this extractor here was important because as an elevator is traveling down the empty shaft, it creates a huge draft of air. Like if you think that it's like kind of like a plunger, it's pulling air in as it's dropping and it's sucking air back up as the elevator is coming back up. So that can create a vacuum and the thing won't work effectively. So you need to install an easy way to get air in and out of that shaft. And so they put a huge kind of vent here specifically for that purpose. Just moving along here, you can see that some of these windows are open. If you look through the windows, you can just catch some of that Tudor style paneling, which are from the first class private promenades of the suites. There was a set of suites, both port and starboard. These were by far the most expensive rooms on the ship, and you got your own private promenade. And this is fairly well known, but you can just make out some of that detail. And in fact, some of that paneling is actually still there down on the wreck because I think it was made out of teak, which is very hard wearing timber. Now, if you look just below the promenades here, you'll see a ton of rivets. Now, these weren't any old rivets. These were steel rivets, and they were the most visible on the ship. They were really big. They were so big, in fact, they had to be driven in, not by hand, but with a riveting machine that was suspended from the Arrel gantry when they were actually building the Titanic. Now, the reason these are here is because this is the center point of the ship that is under the most stress as the Titanic is going up and over waves, kind of like this. And because it's so long, the Titanic and her sisters would bend and sag as they go over. In fact, all ships do it. This was kind of like pioneering engineering at the time. They didn't really have any simulators like we do today to figure out how much reinforcement you need in the center of the ship to keep it from bending and cracking. Sometimes they'd over-reinforce it, and sometimes it's better to be a little more flexible as you're going over waves like that, or else you might crack your hull plating. And in fact, the 3 German sisters, the Borland trio, the lead ship being the Imperator, had serious problems with hull cracking because they were just so heavily reinforced amidships that the ship couldn't actually bend or sag as it went over. It didn't have the flexibility, so of course the hull plating, the ship's skin, would kind of just tear. In fact, the Olympic did get a little bit of tearing at some point during her career. I think it was in a storm, but not nearly as badly as the German ships. But anyway, Titanic was heavily reinforced here. The steel hull plating of the side of the ship was doubled or tripled in thickness, so they added just additional plates to make sure it was really heavily reinforced, and then drove these massive rivets into the side. And in fact, you might be confused to think, well, why can't you see any of the other rivets in the ship? Why is it only along what we call a strength deck here, up on B deck, which is this part here? Why can you only see the B deck down to about D deck riveting and not the rest of the ship? Well, for aesthetic purposes and also to create more like a hydrodynamic hull form as the ship's moving through the water, the rest of the rivets on the ship were countersunk. So essentially they'd punch a hole in the plating as normal where they were going to actually put the rivet, and then they would cut out a little bit around the side so that the rivet could sit in flush, and then they would cover it in primer and paint and you just couldn't see it. The rivet was there, it essentially disappeared. So there are hundreds of thousands, millions of rivets holding the ship together, but in photographs you can't see them. You can only see the ones holding the strength deck together because they couldn't be countersunk. It wasn't as strong as having like a big fat bulb-headed rivet sitting on the outside holding that plating together. There's a couple of external clues here that can tell you this ship burned coal. The first and most obvious one is that the hull is painted black. That's because back in the day, coal was really, really dirty. The dust that it kicked up would essentially stain anything around it black. So the most obvious thing to do is to paint whatever is touching it black. This also gives you a clue as to how the Titanic refueled. You can see that there are actually these little doors down here. I'll show you one now. These doors were coal ports, and essentially how these worked is you could swing these open and load coal into them. It's a process known as bunkering because it was filling up the Titanic's coal bunkers. Essentially the way they'd do it is they would take these little triangular things up here on the promenade deck here. These are called coaling outriggers, and essentially you could swing them out over the side, and they provided something that you could winch buckets of coal up on and into those open coal ports and then slowly fill the ship. And in fact, bunkering took hours and hours, up to like 24 hours. So it took a very, very long time to fill a ship's bunkers with coal. You'd have a barge floating down here at the waterline, and that would be where they'd be sourcing that coal from to fill the ship. You can also see some holes down here at the waterline. These are what are known as scuppers. They're essentially designed to like get rid of water that you don't need in the ship anymore. So think toilets, showers, sinks and drains and things like that. Grey water or dirty water, water you don't want to recirculate back into the ship. Now here amidships between the number 2 and 3 funnel, there's a few interesting things going on. So first of all, you'll see there's a ton of big vents. These are really tall. I'll zoom in on one now. These are just tall vents facing one direction. I just made a video about how they heated and cooled the Titanic. I specifically talked about this type of vent. It's called a cowl vent. Typically, cowl vents could be moved. They had a handle on the side, and you could position it into the wind to catch air and funnel it down and provide fresh air in the ship. These ones didn't move, they were fixed. And the fact that they're so tall and facing backwards gives you a bit of a clue as to what they were used for. These were actually extraction vents, so they weren't used for pulling fresh air in, but spewing foul air out. So think air from bathrooms and galleys and kitchens and things like that, and even just air, stale air in the bottom of the ship. This is how you'd get it out. And the reason they were so tall was that the stale air would pass over the heads of passengers as they were promenading along. And they face backwards so that the natural draft of the ship as it's moving along at, like 21 knots will just carry that and just disperse it and get it out of the ship. They were powered though. They had these, strong electric fans called Scirocco fans that would pull that air out. Also, another interesting little point here is this marking. This is essentially like a loading marker. I'll zoom in on it. There are a couple of letters here. They basically mark out where fresh and salt water over summer and winter would sit. So it's basically like the natural load line of the ship so that you could visually tell if the ship was sitting right in the water. And then some of the decks on top were actually marked in. So you can see little white markings showing where, I think what's this here? That's D deck, E deck, F deck, and so on, all the way up to C deck there. It's not really picked up in photographs, but we know it was there. Moving right along, we get to the 4th funnel, which is probably the most interesting funnel on the Titanic because I feel like it's so mischaracterized. People will tell you this was a dummy funnel, which is kind of like a third of the truth. This played a very, very important role on the ship. And it wasn't just there for looks. Yes, at the time it was a craze to have a 4-funneled ship, and it looked strong and powerful with 4 funnels. But this played a number of roles. The most important being it vented hot air and gases out of some of the galleys on the ship. It provided a flue for a chimney from the galleys down directly below it, the kitchens. It also provided fresh air deep down into the turbine room, which was separate from the ship's engine room and needed its own natural source of intake and extraction of fresh air. But it also serviced the first class smoking room, which was directly below it. So you can see this pipe running directly from the boat deck up into the base of the 4th funnel was where the chimney smoke from the first class smoking room would basically rise up and then be vented up and out of the funnel. So the 4th funnel would spew smoke out of it, not as much as the others, of course, but it wouldn't be unusual to see a little smoke coming out of it at any time. And this was the only functioning fireplace on the ship. Now, Olympic originally didn't have this setup. This was a lesson learned from the Olympic that they implemented on Titanic. They had another method of kind of venting that smoke. And I think it involved some kind of thing around the promenade deck here, but smoke was kind of spewing out of it and it made it a little bit uncomfortable for passengers. So on Titanic, they just put a pipe there, it worked fine, and they did that on Olympic as well. Interestingly though, because the 4th funnel here didn't have an uptake like the others did, the uptakes led all the way down into the boilers and they would run really, really hot, up to like 300 degrees Fahrenheit or more. It meant that this funnel was essentially mostly hollow on the inside and you could climb up it with ladders. So it provided an emergency egress point, which someone actually used during the sinking. And it was not uncommon for engineers or stokers to come up here and have a smoke. There's photographs of guys up here kind of just hanging out. And in fact, as Titanic was departing, one of the final photographs taken of it, you can just see a human head at the top of this funnel. It's one of the ship's engineers or firemen just catching a bit of fresh air. A pretty cool viewpoint. There's a really great photograph of Olympic in dock taken from the top of this funnel, and you're just looking back over the side of the ship. You couldn't do this on any of the other funnels though, because they'd be running really, really hot. Now just behind this funnel, you can see the second class entrance. Now second class had their own elevator running down into the bottom of the ship. You can see that the machinery for the elevator was kept on top of this deck house. This is what this little box on top is. This is essentially just like winches, electric winches and machinery for pulling that elevator up and down. We mentioned before that you need an extraction point or an ingress point for fresh air as an elevator is going up and down. So you can see that there's a big extractor there as well. That machinery room is in pretty decent condition on the wreck. The roof is rotted away, so you can just kind of like peek in and see some of the machinery that was involved. Moving towards the back of the ship now, you can see the rear mast, which was called the main mast, has a little pole running to the boat deck. This was a rafter, so this was essentially used for awning. If you wanted to cover this area up, if it was too hot or if it was raining, you could essentially rig canvas over the top of this thing and attach it to either side of the A-deck promenade there, and you would have like a little canvas roof. It wasn't used very often, but on the Olympic, they had a bit of a novel idea for this big rafter and turned it into a swing. Just forward of this, you had the Palm Court Cafe and the Veranda Cafe, and essentially these were really, really popular, especially with female passengers and families, and essentially you would have young kids running around the A-deck promenade there. And on Olympic, they figured, let's just put a swing there. And it was maybe functioning a little bit like, daycare, where you would have your kids kind of like playing while you just sit and have a coffee and watch them. There are some great photographs of kids swinging from that thing. Down here at the after well deck, what's interesting is this crane. The cranes were huge, these electric cranes. They provided a really easy access point if you wanted to kind of like climb or drop a deck. Crew on the Olympic later in their career figured out that you could get from the boat deck up here down to A deck by just kind of like sliding over the railing and climbing down the crane instead of using the ladder, which I think is pretty novel. But on the night of the sinking, third class passengers didn't really know what to do. There was a lock gate just here at the top of this staircase, only knee high, but it maybe provided enough of an obstacle that many of the passengers actually just simply climbed up the side of this crane to get up into the second class area and try and get out of the ship. Now we're getting really towards the stern of the ship here. There's an infamous little thing here, and you can just make it out. There was a skylight cover for the ship's steering engine room, so that sat directly below it, and you could get fresh air and light into the room. In the movie, as the Titanic's sinking, it's that skylight cover that just kind of like explodes open just as Titanic is dropping below the surface, because this part of the ship hadn't properly flooded yet until it was pulled under the ocean bodily as the ship was, in its final plunge. In theory, you probably had like a ton of air being compressed and blasted out of the ship, so stands to reason that this skylight cover would just explode open, but it's a little dramatic moment during the sinking in the film. The docking bridge has been a source of confusion to many, including myself. It had a ship's wheel on top of it, and many thought originally that because this sat atop the docking bridge, it was used during the docking process. But that's not probably necessarily the case. In a lot of photographs of the Olympic, it's just under canvas, like it's being stored there. And it's probably another redundancy. The ship essentially relied on like a hydraulic powered steering. There was this thing called a telemotor all the way at the forward part of the ship, all the way up here at the bridge. This is the wheelhouse right here. And this is where the main ship's wheel was kept. And there was a telemotor there that would essentially send hydraulic signals all the way back where the steering engine room was and control big steam engines that would turn the rudder. Now, if that hydraulic system failed, suddenly you've got no way of steering the ship, right? Well, this wheel on top of the docking bridge was geared directly into the steering engines. So it had no hydraulic line. It was just, if you turn that wheel, it will manually turn those big steering engines. So probably another redundancy. A lot of warships have, for example, a second steering room separate from the main bridge with a wheel geared directly into the ship's steering engines, so that if the bridge gets shot away, you still have a point at which you can directly steer the ship without having to rely on any of those like hydraulic lines or anything convoluted like that. A hydraulic line can easily be pierced and then you've lost your pressure and suddenly you're not getting the steering signals properly, so that makes total sense. At the back of the ship here, you can just see this little brass thing. That's the technical term. Well, actually, that's not the technical term. This was a capstan pedestal. Essentially, it's a control mechanism. It's a brake for the steam-powered capstan. Now, a capstan is essentially a big drum that can rotate. It's steam-powered, and it will just slowly turn. So if you coil a heavy rope around it, you don't need to get like 20 men to pull this rope in. You just coil it around the capstan, and it will slowly pull that rope in. Now that pedestal was a brake. It had a wheel with a little handle. You could open that wheel up, it would apply more steam, remove the brake, and suddenly the capstan could spin faster or slower as you needed and pull that line up. When you'd got that line all the way in, you could just like put the brake back on and it would stop. Now the steam engine for this capstan was directly located below in the steering engine room. So at both ends of the ship, you had this kind of like special machinery and handling room. Now the last thing I wanted to talk about was the Titanic's arrangement of propellers. Now, you've got two outboard propellers, and these are essentially directly connected to the ship's steam reciprocating engines, the big main engines, and then that steam from those engines would be fed into a central turbine, which could only operate in one direction, and then that would essentially power a central propeller, which is the smaller propeller seen here, sitting in a cutout in the hull called an aperture. Now the point of the cutout there is so that you could even get a central propeller there in the first place. There was a huge relationship between where a propeller was located and if it would cause like vibrations on the hull. But I think Titanic's aperture there existed purely so you could get a central propeller there. Whereas some other like two-bladed ships would have a cutout just so they wouldn't interfere with the ship's hull and cause vibration. There's huge debate in the Titanic community about whether the Titanic's central propeller had 3 or 4 blades, and there doesn't need to be a debate. All of the photographs you've ever seen of Titanic's propellers are actually the Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship. They all show there was a 4-bladed propeller there, so that was just accepted as fact that Titanic had the same layout. But that's probably not the case, because recently it was discovered that there was an engineering notebook that kept very precise information about the number of propellers, the number of blades, the angle of the propellers, the pitch, the size of the blades on all the Harland and Wolff ships that were being built at the time. And on the Titanic, it shows that she had 3 3-bladed propellers. And the simple truth is, again, this is like early engineering for this kind of thing, and they were just messing around a little bit. So they'd make these propellers out of manganese bronze, and there was a constant battle between the number of propellers and the efficiency of the propeller and if it would vibrate. And so Harland and Wolff, the ship's builders, were constantly kind of like playing around and toying with how many blades they could put on a propeller. There's a number of other Harland and Wolff ships that had this exact kind of layout where you've got an aperture with a central propeller that's actually 3-bladed. And in fact, after the Titanic sank, the Olympic was also given a 3-bladed central propeller, in theory, to test if the efficiency was good. And obviously it wasn't, because that was got rid of, and then Olympic got a 4-bladed propeller. And there's this great photograph from, I think, like 1929, like way later in Olympic's career, that is always misidentified as Titanic's propellers. It's not. It's Olympic. It's 1929. You can see they went back to a central 4-bladed prop. They weren't the only ones to do it. I think originally the Lusitania had 3-bladed propellers. They were replaced with 4-bladed. It wasn't really that cost prohibitive to just keep recreating propellers and kind of like messing with the formula to get greater speed and efficiency out of your design. It was a very, very fluid situation. They were clearly kind of making changes to these ships as they learned lessons from their operation and just kind of learning as they went. So yeah, in my opinion, absolutely, Titanic had a 3-bladed central propeller. The engineering evidence is there. It makes total sense to experiment with it, at least to see if it worked. They didn't get the chance to really test it on the Titanic because the ship sank. So they tried it on Olympic and they abandoned it and went straight back to using a 4-bladed propeller. Unfortunately, we'll never actually know because Titanic's central propeller is buried like 3 or 4 stories down in the silt on the sea floor. But it's still a very interesting discussion. Well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed this brief tour of the Titanic and learned some interesting things. If you did enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. As always, stay safe and stay happy, and I will see you again next time.